I think we've had an interesting, different sort of views on this, and I will continue in that tradition. When Ellen Eisenkorn asked me to write for her latest book a chapter on rankings in Africa, I said, white man now to talk for Africa. She said, no, the issue is that we can't, there's very few researchers in higher education studies who don't only write about their university or their country. And then I remember that Marson and I did a study in the early 2000s where we found like over 60% of all the stuff in higher education studies was done by the researcher on either his or her university or his or her country. So it's a big limit that we have, that we don't look across. So I thought, well, I can't just go and write something for Africa. So for our Hirana project, I put together 3 people that I've been working with for quite a while. Gerald Omer from the University of Pretoria, and Patricio Langa from Eduardo Modlane, and Florence Nakaiva from Makerere. And all 3 of them had done PhDs with us in different ways. So Gerald wrote from the University of Pretoria that rankings contribute to efforts to redefine the university, increase input, and for Pretoria to move out of apartheid isolation, to, which I want to link later to the Chinese experience. He called it getting the feel of the game. Patricio again said that Mozambique is obsessed with rankings, and, but they're much more interested in the fact that the soccer team is just about in the top 100 in the world, and the university isn't in the top 10,000 in the world. But he thought that they used just the talk of rankings. That this project that we did is to promote a group of research universities in Africa, and that they use this to try and move Eduardo Modlane into research orientation, more knowledge production, and that they use this kind of discourse. And Florence said that in Makerere it really helped contribute to increasing the resources, appealing and applying and telling that you're the best university in that part of Africa. And also that management uses it to drive internal reforms, as Liz said. So the title of our chapter was sort of, is the rankings important, interesting, or irrelevant? And actually, to some extent, all 3 apply in Africa, and we couldn't really come to a specific conclusion on it. Here you can see that Africa isn't doing that well in the rankings. 2015, there's been some changes in later rankings, 2016 and 2017. But I want to differ slightly with Zeppelin on Shanghai. I spent some time in Shanghai in 2012 and 13. Shanghai is a very interesting thing. It had nothing to do with global rankings. It was part of the Chinese reform of higher education. The Chinese in 1991 got the shock of their lives with Tiananmen Square. And unlike in Africa, where we've put the students down, the elite often goes to the hotel and orders some Johnny Walker Blue, the Chinese realized that they've got a huge problem. And they rethought the role of higher education in the Chinese society, and particularly in their growth system. And Peter Marson and I in Oslo had this student, Jing Ying, who wrote the best master's dissertation that I've ever read on the Chinese reform system. And they brought the growth of higher education as their central modernization, but also as key underpinning their economic growth. And even into, we're working on a book on universities and cities. They've done fantastic things of these new cities that they built. They almost built around the university. University is one of the central things that they decide on first. So they developed, and Liz had some strange notions here about differentiation. Massification and differentiation was the key. We've got to massify. We've got to give access to everybody. They're now at 40% participation rate. They've got 15 million students. They've brought about the fastest expansion of higher education in the history of humankind. At the same time, they decided they had to differentiate. They had to have a group of institutions which are world-class and which can compete. They started off with a horrible thing called key and non-key institutions. Now, I imagined if in the New South Africa, Stellenbosch was declared a non-key institution, there would have been some. But they've had these projects, 211 project, 1985, 1988, and every time the numbers changed. At one stage, they had 118 institutions that were designated world-class. And I was there actually with Jamil Salmi, this guy from the World Bank, who wrote a lot of this world-class stuff. And they had weird ideas about world-class. But what they wanted was universities that was part of the world. So I said to this guy there, this thing that you gave such a high rating to Nobel Prize winners, you had no Nobel Prize winners in China in the universities. He said, exactly. If we want to be part of the world, then we must have Nobel Prize winners. So it must count. And the very interesting thing was when the Chinese government set out this contract, they opened it up. They excluded Beijing and the other university, the two top universities. And I asked the guy why. He said, we were worried that they were going to develop an indicator system that reflects them. We wanted the indicator system that reflects the world, to judge our own universities. This thing that it became a world thing was never their intention. They never thought about it. They were using this to allocate resources and identify the different universities. And now they've done an interesting thing. They've got this 42 universities, which is now designated double first class. But then they've got 90 universities with specialist disciplines. So it gave a much bigger group of institutions a particular focus or a particular thing that they could contribute to, so that they didn't feel left out. And they had some principles. They introduced tuition, exactly the other way that we're going. And how did they deal with the poor students? They set up Rural Credit Corporation, and they've got, of course, the Chinese Development Bank, which is one of the big money development banks in the world. And what they simply did is they gave the middle class who were having extra money in the rural credit bureaus, they would get a higher percentage investment return than in a normal bank. So the middle class was putting money into the credit bureaus, and the poorer students were borrowing, loan schemes. And this guy said to me, in China, you don't default on your loan. You do have a kind of a system that goes with it. And I'll show you now about the trade-off. The other incredible thing that I couldn't really get around to, I mean, they went from 18,000 PhDs in 1978 to 50,000 in 2008. And increasingly, in all the top institutions, it has to be in English. So for them, this world-class thing was also part of becoming part of the world. It was an internationalization. And in 2000, they had 9 universities in the top 500. In 2016, they had 44. And the first developing country that has 2 universities in the top 100. I'm part of some other thing, International Panel on Social Progress, and there we developed some kind of a little model around if you want to develop your higher education system. It's enrollment, public investment, and private costs. And how you balance those 3 things has an influence on inequality and economic growth. And here's just an example. If you look at the Norwegian system, very high public investment, very high enrollment, and very low private cost. China, public 3%. They were over at 3.5% at one stage of GDP. And they're now down at about 2.5 or 2.6%. When we say medium enrollment, I mean they've got 40% participation rate, while ours is 20. And then the private costs are relatively high. In South Africa, we had low public investment, low enrollment, 20%, and high private cost, which is now going to shift with a new, presumably it's going to shift towards a high public investment and a lower private cost. The problem of Africa, of course, is we're low in public investment, public enrollment, and in private cost. So if we want to get the African system moving, one of the things that you're going to have to see is how can we inject more money into the higher education system. And one of them is going to have to be fees. So our project, we decided that this rankings is completely beyond what we should be talking about at the moment in Africa. And we put together this 8 flagship universities in Africa. I'll show you now. And then we developed a set of indicators for them. Input and output indicators with targets. The targets were sort of based on South African, in which we were looking at, after, this is a 10-year project that has just come to an end now. We looked at things like enrollment in SET. What is a research? We're trying to develop a kind of a profile or characteristics of a research university in Africa. In terms of teaching, postgraduate, undergraduate, most of these African universities, the undergraduates is 90%, which means that it's basically an undergraduate university. The academic staff must be senior rank. There's surprisingly large numbers of junior and low-level staff members. And in many of these African universities, it's very difficult to become a professor. You have to have quite a few publications, and you have to have lots of years, etc. There's a kind of an old English tradition where there's only one professor in the department, for instance. So it reduces, it makes the faculty, doesn't give a senior ranking that can actually contribute to things like doctoral supervision and things like that. And then student-staff ratios. The other myth of the African university is this overcrowded classrooms. There isn't a student-staff participation rate in these universities. In business, it's 150 to 1 in some universities, but it's 8 to 1 in science. So there's a huge discrepancy within the institutions. And then our big focus was the issue of how many doctoral students do we produce, master's students, doctoral graduates, and then of course the research output. These are the universities that participated, and you can see there, UCT actually produces more research output than all these 7 other universities together. But in the 10 years of the project, they have all improved. They've all got strategic plans to try and improve their doctoral output and their research output, which although from a low basis shows that there's actually a shift. And they're trying to reduce their undergraduate enrollment a bit. And then we've developed some sort of fancy little graphics that shows, I mean, if you look at the top, where we set targets, if you look at the relationship between publication staff with PhDs and student-staff ratio, then you can locate it or map the institutions in different places. So basically, that's my view of rankings in Africa, is that what we need much more at the moment is a strategy to develop a set of strong research-oriented, knowledge-producing institutions. And what kind of indicators can we use to actually do that? And none of these rankings, Robert, is much help in that. Thanks.